Good day everyone, I am Michael, the moderator for this webinar. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, which is Behavioral Issues, Conflict and Incivility in Workplace, a New Era in 2024. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our presenter for today, Diane LD. Diane LD, President and Founder of Advantage HR Consulting LLC, is a senior human resource professional with over 30 years of experience in HR arena. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to welcome and thank our participants for joining us today. As Michael mentioned, our webinar today will help us learn how to deal with behavioral issues, conflicts, and incivility in our workplaces. So let's get started. So problematic behavior usually develops over time. The more proactive an organization is in dealing with these problems, the more likely it is that the organization will increase its chances for a positive outcome. So the bottom line is, and one thing we know for sure, is that conflict in the workplace is inevitable. So conflict can erupt from the smallest word or action. So what creates conflict? There are basic components of conflict we need to be aware of. It's also important to understand the common sources of conflict. And believe it or not, there are both positive and negative outcomes of conflict. So let's talk about those. The negative outcomes of conflict are pretty obvious, as we'll see when we go through the chart below. So let's look at negative outcomes. On the positive side, when it's managed properly, conflict can be a healthy enabler of growth and professional and business development. We also need to talk about conflict resolution styles. In order to successfully resolve conflict, we need to be familiar with these types of resolution styles. So the first one is avoidance, accommodating, standing your ground. Compromising is a big step toward conflict resolution. Collaborating. So let's look at some specific behavioral issues in the workplace and some strategies to address them. I've listed here on this slide and the next slide and a half some different types of behavioral issues that might crop up. And I've given some very high-level strategies for addressing those. An employee refuses to follow a direct order or work rule due to concerns about legality or safety. You have an employee who's stealing from your workplace. Let's also talk about incivility in our workplaces. We need to first start out with what is civility. Civility encompasses more than just good manners and etiquette. It includes behavior that helps to preserve the norms for mutual respect at work. This chart here lists some examples of civility versus incivility. So your appraisal of the behavior determines whether it breaks the norms of your workplace and crosses over into becoming uncivil. Incivility has a great impact on both your employees and on your business. So on this slide here, I've listed some incivility coping strategies, from least effective to the most effective. So how can we go about addressing incivility within our organizations? The first thing we need to be aware of are the triggers within our culture that can make incivility more evident. So the organization has a responsibility. They must develop a system where incivility is prevented to the extent possible. Uncivil conduct is taken seriously and addressed immediately. This slide here lists some tips for enhancing civility. So let's move on now to the topic of bullying. Bullying can take many forms, but it's generally considered to be any behavior that is unwelcomed, offensive, unsolicited, or objectionable. So the formal definition of bullying is repeated health-harming mistreatment of one or more persons who are the targets by one or more perpetrators. It can also be acts of commission or omission. We also need to realize that bullying can sometimes cross the threshold into discrimination and a hostile work environment, interference in or sabotage of another's work projects. As you can imagine, bullying affects an employee's job performance. The impact that bullying has on organizations can be very extensive. It affects the overall health of an organization. And I think we can all agree an unhealthy workplace has many negative effects. So employers have obligations when it comes to bullying. I think we can all agree there's a high cost of behavioral issues, conflict, and incivility on our companies. These types of issues affect the company's bottom line. For that reason, resolving performance or productivity problems are of the utmost importance. So where does an employer begin? Well, you first need to have working knowledge of employment law. So on this slide, I've listed just a handful of employment laws that you need to be aware of. Seeking solutions. What works when you're trying to seek a solution? What doesn't work? So there are some proactive measures employers can use. They're faced with these types of issues. The first thing, publish your organization's code of ethics in your employee handbook. So resolving issues. What are some tactics we can put in place when trying to get resolution? So how do we go about resolving issues? First thing we need to do is acknowledge that the conflict exists and that it needs resolution. So progressive discipline is a system that provides a graduated range of responses to employee performance or conduct issues. When it's done correctly, it allows managers to intervene and correct employee behavior at the first sign of trouble. Obviously, we don't want to delay or ignore the behavior. The first step is coaching. So what's the definition of coaching? When is coaching appropriate? Step 2 is giving that employee a verbal warning. When is a verbal warning appropriate? Step 3 is a written warning. This is a serious disciplinary measure. When is a written warning appropriate? And termination is step 4 of the process. Some types of misconduct that even if they occur only a single time, you need to immediately investigate, get your organization's legal counsel involved before terminating that individual. So when you're investigating complaints, how do you go about doing that? So some benefits of conducting an effective investigation. Some business goals of conducting an investigation. So how do you conduct an investigation? The first thing is you need to have a plan. So let's talk about how we conduct the actual interviews. Who should be interviewed? With respect to the sequence of interviews, where should you conduct these interviews? Listen and observe. This is where you need to practice active listening. At the end of the interview, ask, is there anything else I should know? At the close of the interview, give witnesses your contact information. The post-investigative steps. When should you involve legal counsel? Consider consulting with legal counsel during your investigation, during the following scenarios. We also need to be aware of the role of performance management systems in assisting with behavioral or performance issues. You know, the high cost of problem employees confirms that the most effective management tactic is to prevent problems in the first place. And this can be accomplished via effective performance evaluations. The performance appraisal process is just that, a process. It's not a form. So I want to just give you some highlights of the importance of having solid documentation. Having solid documentation can become your best defense. So what defines solid documentation? It outlines all the steps that were taken. You also need to create a document control process. I just want to give you some ideas of practices for a healthy workplace. These are practices that promote positive employee relations. So in conclusion, The important issue is that whether there will be conflict in your workplace, because conflict is inevitable, but how we respond to it. Thank you. I again would like to thank our participants for joining us. I hope you found the presentation to be informative and helpful.
So that does conclude the session for today. Thank you everyone for participating. You may all disconnect now. Bye.